Mm-mm. Good afternoon and welcome to the Sister Act podcast. I'm Hernessa Faryad. I'm the founder and one of the co-hosts here at this podcast, along with Rabbi Susan. We have today um, a very interesting conversation, a conversation that I think has been happening a lot these days, especially with what's been going on in this country. And needless to say, that it's a conversation that had to have happened and still needs to continue to happen. I want to thank American Muslim Institution, which is the branding umbrella organization for the Sister Act podcast. And if you have any questions, you can also jot it down here in the Zoom broadcast or on Facebook Live, and we'll get to them at the end of the show. Today we have with us Ron Campbell, who is a pillar within the Loudoun County community here in Northern Virginia. Ron Campbell was elected to town council in November 2016. Prior to his election to council, he served on the Leesburg Technology and Communications Commission and the Leesburg Environmental Commission. He is currently a member of the Loudoun County Community Criminal Justice Board. Previously, Ron served on 2 Virginia State Task Force on Sexual Violence, one dealing with institutions of higher education, and one with K-12 schools led by then Lieutenant Governor Don Beyer. Councilmember Campbell represents the town of Leesburg on the Virginia Municipal League's Finance Committee. He serves as council liaison to the Thomas Balch Library Commission. Councilmember Campbell was born and raised in the Bronx, New York. Through school and work, he has lived in New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. He has been a resident of Leesburg since 2001, and I'd like to point out that everyone on this panel today on the screen that you see are native New Yorkers. Welcome to the show, Ron.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ron, thank you for being with us today. I know this has been a challenging time, to say the least, and you're no doubt experiencing a range of emotions while trying to process all that has transpired and to work with the people in the community. And we want to provide you with some space and the opportunity to talk about how you're feeling and how you're processing everything that is happening.
Thank you. I do want to thank the American Muslim Institution and my sister Hernessa and Rabbi Susan. This conversation is important for a number of reasons, particularly for an older African American like me, who was born in the 50s. And we've seen these range of conversations and these range of conflicts in our community and the range of supposedly solutions and resolutions and attempts to do better, and yet we still find ourselves here today. So some of it is a sense of anger and frustration that we haven't done better about police brutality in particular. And the outcry for that as a community should not have always been one-sided. And I'd like to think that our communities are more aware, and I think our people are, based on what we've seen in the last 3 to 4 weeks, in terms of, I call it an intergenerational, an interfaith, an intercommunity outcry, where people of all stripes are saying this is wrong. And that I'm encouraged by that outcry, but we have to do more than be encouraged. We have to do more than listen to rhetoric. We have to do more than just pray and gather. And it's good that people come together, but it's finding those solutions. and then seeking those common purposes that will tie us together as a community that have divided us as a community, is where the work comes in. And so I'm happy to be here today to really talk about kind of that allyship and that partnership piece. But I can tell you personally, I am not fatigued of doing this work. The last, I guess I started when I was about 5, because my dad was a rent strike leader in New York. And I was voluntarily bused before busing was an enforced act in New York City to a Jewish neighborhood. And I like to joke that I've been to more bar mitzvahs than I've been to weddings. But the idea is that as a community, what happened for me was I learned. I was immersed. I had experiences. I had values that were shared, and I had an appreciation for other faiths and other cultures that it just seems so strange to me that people today don't have and are not willing to have. And we still call that Sunday, as if we can only worship on Sundays. That Sunday worship hour between 11 and 12 is the most segregated hour. But what about Monday, and Tuesday, and Wednesday, Thursday? We pray all over, so why can't we gather on any other time except Sunday? So I'm happy to be here, but thank you for asking.
Thank you so much, Ron. Ron, can I ask you to move a little closer to your laptop because the volume is a bit low? And if your phone is near your laptop, if you could move it away, because there is a kind of a hissing sound that comes sometimes from the phone. Thank you. Okay, so I mean, I know this conversation is so long, and I don't think we can cover everything just in one episode. But you know, a lot of people have been posting, you know, Black pages on their Facebook and their social media, and people are using this word allyship a lot lately, you know, in various definitions. I would like to talk, you know, have you talk about what allyship isn't, you know, in the Black Lives Matter movement.
Well, let me just talk about allyship, period, because I don't think it's particular to the Black Lives Movement. And even if people were to Google the definition of ally or look at, you know, Webster's dictionary, where we find ourselves today is in this experience of trust and integrity about how people relate and how they experience each other. So I think whether it's the Black Lives Movement or any movement, you know, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, allyship, and any other types of partnership, it's this genuineness that comes across where the integrity is trusted, that somebody's there because they really value your humanness, they value your cause, they value your mission, and it's not just popular because it's the popular thing to do. It's not the political thing to do. It's the human and the personal thing to do. And so I think what people are looking for today is that someone that's willing not just to stand by their side, but stand up. So it's not someone who goes to the march and demonstration and then refuses to have that conversation at home or refuses to have that conversation on their job because something's at risk. It's someone who genuinely understands and feels that this is standing next to someone has an important value and role in all of our communities, all of our lives. And that's the personal piece that you can't always see or judge, but it's what people want now. They don't want it to come and go. They want it to somehow, these relationships to be sustained. So it's more than just, you know, raising your fist or wearing a sign or wearing a button. It's really understanding what's at stake if we fail to be allies for one another in all of our experiences.
One of our speakers a couple of weeks ago spoke about the idea of being an upstander and not just a bystander, and that may fit with what you're talking about. And I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of allyship, because I think one of the challenges that's been raised is that there are many people who have expressed that they want to help, but they're just not sure where to start and what to do. So how can people, if people say, I want to be an ally, or I feel like I'm an ally, but how do I do that? What are some active steps? What are some things that people can do?
The best way I can describe it is, part of what's missing, and I'm the executive director of the Loudoun Freedom Center, and we talk about African American history in Loudoun County, and the deficit for our school systems and what they teach is that people's histories have been either deliberately left out or chopped up in a way that people don't understand roles, relationships, and connections. So my experience as an American shouldn't be any different than any other immigrant experience except for the period of slavery. The rights, the roles, and responsibilities as an American citizen should be ours, but there's been these disruptions where it's not been as equally applied for all of us. Who teaches someone that? If I have to become the teacher, then I am confronting everything that person has learned that they think is true. And then I get to be attacked based on I'm only saying it because it's my truth. Now, an effective ally has to be willing to learn. How do they learn? Where do they learn? Who do they learn from? I always used to say, I spent my working career in higher education, that when I was hired, it wasn't on a job description that I was hired to train or teach white people how to be better. That would have required a little bit more money and a little bit more time. But in a partnership relationship, having each other's experiences, I have no problem helping people learn history, but they also have to be willing to put in some time and some energy. So learning requires work, and working sometimes requires being side by side as an ally. Then I think people have to add their voice. They have to be willing to look at their voice in the conversation. Don't just sit back and say, Ron, I want to glean it off from you. No, I want your voice to be just as powerful as it plays a role. And then showing up. People have to show up and invite people in. So it's not that you have to come to everything that's Black, but I also want to see your communities, because I may not have those inroads into your community. You may not have them into mine, but are we willing to show up in each other's places? Like I've said, I've been to many synagogues and many different circumstances. I'm not sure how many people know what a brisk is, but it's something that you have to witness to believe. But there are things that we all can appreciate if we show up. And sometimes there's actually some good food too, particularly when you break Ramadan. And the challenge then is, at the end of the day, and this is the hard part, are people willing, and this was the same in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s when it came to issues of race, are people willing to challenge their own communities for what's at stake? Because that challenge may be offensive to your family and others in the community. You may lose friends, partnerships, and you may lose what you think is status or appeal. But to do what's right sometimes requires that ability to be strong enough to voice what you really believe in is right.
Thank you. Just following up, and I think you really answered this question already, but maybe we can take it a little bit further. Is it allyship? Would you consider it allyship if other communities ask leaders or members of the Black community to teach them what they can do and how they can be true allies? Or where should the responsibility lie? Should the responsibility lie on the shoulders of those who are not part of the Black community to educate themselves? And I guess the question that goes along with that is, that's true allyship to me, but I want to hear what it is to you, more importantly, for people to take the initiative to do that learning and to do that hard work of educating themselves. And I think there are many of us who also want to make sure that we're educating ourselves in the way we need to be to really be true allies, if that makes sense. Like, how can we really, what are the steps we should take? What should we be learning? And And as someone said in a conversation 2 weeks ago, it's not enough just to have the books on the shelf. But it's doing that work that you talked about. And what is that work? Where should people start?
Well, thank you for that follow-up, because it is a little deeper than just having a change of heart or having a political consciousness or awareness. And there certainly is no magic bullet. I mean, we all have different paths for how we got to be where we are, or whatever it is we believe in. But there are some things I think that are effective. As I looked at the definition, it's always valid to ask for help. It's always valid. And however that help may be. Some of us are at different places. It's like it'd be crazy for me to assume. We used to say this in the 70s, everybody is not black just because they're black, in the sense of somebody's consciousness. So I may be at a tipping point where the last thing I want is a white person to come and ask me for some help, when all I want to do is torch the city. So we really have to be conscious and aware of the humility that we bring to that question when we're asking someone to share, because it is personal and it could be sensitive. And no matter how genuine the person asking might be, the reality is that it may take a relationship to make that happen, because there's a trust. And as I said before, I used to get challenged a lot on my version of history as being my truth versus the truth that was taught in schools. And they called it truth, and that's how I taught history in schools. So the openness to understand about what it takes and what it means and what someone's asking for, I think starts with a personal relationship. And that's where people should start. Ask me my experience, my values. Ask me about my family, my growing up in the Bronx, where I spent many of a Christmas Eve in the 41st Police Precinct, because my dad decided to lead a rent strike, and it was important for him to use his family as an example in leading that rent strike. So my passion, comes from a place that's, been with me for over, 62 years. So I think that's helpful for people. It's never incorrect to ask for help. The only judgment may be, who are you asking? Why are you asking? And is it appropriate to ask at this particular time?
Thanks, Ron. Excuse the sound you're hearing outside. There's apparently a thunderstorm happening here in Sterling. So I'm sure either one of you are gonna
it's happening here too.
Get past here.
I think it skipped Ron. But Ron, excuse me. I did ask before about what allyship isn't, and I asked that specifically because a lot of people feel the things that they're doing and the impact that they're having is allyship, when it actually isn't what the Black community wants or needs. And I actually wanted you to kind of expand on that, what allyship isn't, because, I see people who may be white, who are experts, they call themselves experts in history or what they have learned, and they're sitting on panels and having this discussion and talking about racism, and it undermines the work of the Black community, right? Or people saying that they're not racist, right? But because their faith maybe is telling them that racism is not part of who we are as Muslims or people of the Jewish faith or Christian or whatever faith they believe in, but they themselves do have racist propensities when it comes to certain types of people. So I wanted to kind of have you dive into that, because people really need to know how they might be hurting the process and hurting their own way of understanding what allyship means.
You crossed a very important line, and a good one to cross. This whole idea about racism and even the impacts of systemic racism, and the impacts of what a person thinks about themselves and their own values as being racist versus not racist, and the whole definition of how we look at and again, I call it this systemic challenge to beliefs, whether they be religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, or, social beliefs somehow. I'm not racist because I have a Black friend. I'm not racist because I belong to, the NAACP. I'm not racist because, my forefathers and the civil rights movement in the Jewish community, we were all allies. I'm not racist because I'm a Muslim. So how does a person see themselves in their racism versus their ability to be an ally? And sometimes people separate the two, and that's the mental challenge. That what I say, we really have to break down people and relationships and really start to engage. It was important mental work in the 70s, and it's important personal mental work now, where people have to unlearn things that they've learned and be willing to get challenged personally about really re-envisioning human relationships at the end of the day. The stuff about race and religion, it's only one way to get to heaven, or there's only one way to be black. And we have those conflicts. We don't call them races within the African American culture, but we do have different communities. So how people see me as a black person, or a person or American of African descent, or an African American, it may be different than how they see another person sitting next to me. So the question I think you're really asking is, how do we get this out? How do we get people to reveal themselves and who they are, even before we get to the point of allyship and partnership? Because it's not, and this is why it perpetuates and it continues, because it's not an easy thing. It really is. It's not getting someone to reveal their racism. And I think we hear this other term that people are using now, is how do you get to be somebody to be anti-racist? Which is a whole nother level of maturity and another level of work. So if you were to ask me, if you do this, does this mean that you're an ally? Or if you don't do this, does it mean you're not an ally? When I don't know who you are, and I don't know your struggles or your problems. So I'm just gonna be real simple. Allies don't disappear, right? It's not a flavor of the month, flavor of the week. It's not when things get hot or cold. Allies are willing to stand, and willing, again, not just to come out, but to invite you in. So I'm willing and have been willing to go into many communities that are willing to invite me to do things that may be personally uncomfortable. But it's a struggle for me to get those same allies to come to an NAACP meeting. Why is that? I'm just asking them to come to a meeting, not asking them to pray, convert, eat. Just come to a meeting and listen and learn, and we cannot get the turnout. Now, fortunately, in Loudoun County, the NAACP membership has increased over the last couple of years, and people are looking for work to do. But it is somewhat more personal than what we really want to believe, and less political, because that political outcome would mean more people like me are getting elected, and they're not. More people like me are getting supported to even run for office and encouraged, and we're not. But we're being used for our votes, but we aren't being used for the outcomes of legislation and policies. And now it seems like, okay, Black Lives Matter must mean that you're anti-police, rather than you're looking for justice and law enforcement. And we all know the criminal justice system has been broke for a while. So if we take that personal piece and we turn it into actionable piece, we have to get results. We haven't taken that personal piece because it gets abandoned at the voting booth.
No, you're absolutely correct. Even within the Muslim community here in the United States, because we have a large immigrant population that has come from all over the world, they don't really understand this 401 years of what I think you heard that. Not going to compete with that. 401 years of what has happened to the Black community here in the United States. They really don't understand because they haven't studied it. They haven't read upon it. They don't understand, like you said, the systematic racism that has been embedded in the foundation of the United States, whether it comes to housing, healthcare, education, you name it, it has always worked to a disadvantage to the Black community in the United States. So when they say things like, oh, this community is just not working hard enough, or you just want to like stay home and not do anything, they don't understand that the system is rigged against them, right? And that we have to be allies in working against that and changing the policies that have mandated these rules, that have put a structure down in the foundation that, people from the Black community can't get fair housing. right? They're always being moved around for new companies and corporations wanting to take over neighborhoods and push the Black community out, right? There always is a distinction between who they're allowing to come into their colleges. So all these things are part of the problem. And you quoted Ibram Kendi's book of how can you be an anti-racist? And in his book, his introduction is just about that. Like, what does it mean to be an anti-racist? Not enough just to say, I'm not a racist, right? You actually have to do work. And you saying what you just said is allyship is not disappearing. I think that is just so profound, because it's the physical work that needs to be put in. It's you being present. It's you being actually in the moment, going and actually doing things that are going to bring about that change, whether it's talking to your elected officials or bringing up issues that you feel are racist against the Black community. All these things that people need to see and hear has to come out. But because and I can speak on behalf of the Muslim community, is because they don't know, especially anybody who is 35 and older, who might have come here as an adult, didn't really get that education. And even for those of us who did grow up here, like you said, you get to learn a certain history point of view,
right,
when it comes to schools.
But none of us would tolerate what has happened, and been revealed under COVID-19, right? The disproportionate impact on communities that have always been disproportionately affected. So for some people, it wasn't a surprise, but for too many people, that's a tolerable impact of the number of deaths. And even in Loudoun County, the impact on Hispanics in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that somehow it's tolerable. When we look at education, it's tolerable that some kids are afforded an opportunity to really achieve academically, and some aren't, and that's tolerable, and then we want to blame parents and others. But I stand up and speak on behalf of all children and all families when I represent Leesburg. I don't represent one party over the other, and that may not make some people happy, but I believe in people over politics at the end of the day. I have my personal politics and my values, but every human life is sacred in the faith tradition I come from. And so when I'm speaking at the school board meeting, I'm speaking on behalf of all children, even if the issue might be equity. Not so some people don't show up because my child isn't personally affected. And you're right, they have excuses. And we don't want to necessarily start calling people out, but I think what we want people to do now is rise up. We say stand up. So on May 31st, we had a silent walk in Leesburg, and it was really about standing up and sending a love card to the George Floyd family in Minneapolis. And we expected 200, we got over 1,500. And people brought their families. They brought their children in strollers. It was intergenerational, interfaith, multi-politically disciplinary event and activity, because people now, and we've seen it these last few weeks, and we'll continue to see it, people are showing up. But you're right, the second part of it is, what do I do now? How do I become more involved? What's the investment? What does it take to be an ally? How do I learn? Who's gonna, partner with me? Who's gonna have space and tolerance for me, for my intolerance or for my learning? And basically the question is, where is it safe to have these dialogue and discussion? Is it safe in the mosque? Is it safe? And where is it safe? In our communities. So people are imposing upon, their personal friendships and personal relationships. I've gotten a few late night texts and emails from people around the country who've been perplexed. But it's also that time to have those honest conversations in our community where we can. So I hope to see more programs, more people listening in on events and activities like this, and giving us a chance to really have these conversations that may be a little bit difficult to have, but the outcome is that we want the partnerships for all of our events and activities, for all of our missions, all of our values, all of our programs and services, to really impact the greater community. But it's not going to be easy. And it's not just because there are killings now as if there never were murders before.
No, absolutely. And one of the things we're trying to do within the Northern Virginia Muslim community is allow a platform to happen is to have a platform to happen where we're bringing race equity educators from the Black community to talk about what that means to the Muslim community, because again, these are people who have no idea what's going on. You know, they don't understand the backbone and the history of what has happened in the 401 years. So we have to start them from like basic information and then build them up, give them that framework, give them that knowledge, and then tell them what it means to be an ally, why you have to work. And then even the difference between equity and equality are so different, right? Equity doesn't mean you give everyone the same thing. Because when you give that, it does not mean you're being equal, but you're not being equitable, right? What the challenges that one person has, if you give them the same thing that somebody else has, and they're not being benefited from that, you're not equitable, right? So all these things are part of this process that we need to educate within our own community, within our communities where we think we don't have racism, or, you know, because like we said, right, our faith says one thing, but we do something else. And what does that really mean? And allowing people to have that platform to have this conversation and bring in people who can actually have these difficult conversations, and difficult conversations are what makes people change. It brings in the information that you would normally not hear. It brings in things that you might reflect back on yourself and say, wait, that actually does happen in my family. We do use slurs. We do make fun of people. We do say, oh, my daughter's not going to marry him because he's Black, or my son's not going to marry her because she's Black, or from, you know, and bring that racism in the house. But then they say, oh, we're not racist. I'm like, well, no, that you're actually racist. You know, you're just not seeing it that way. So we have to point it out, so that they understand that we're not saying something to degrade them. We're saying something that has to, like you said, change their frame of mind and how they're thinking. I remember I was on a Zoom call on a board, and this one man who was from the India subcontinent said, oh, there's no racism here. No one's racist against me. This is not a color issue. And almost everybody on the screen was white except one Black guy, and he was quiet. And I was like, wait, did I just hear that right? Like, did he just say this is not a color issue? And I had to call him out. And when I called him out, that actually gave the only other Black person on that call to say something after me, because he felt like he didn't have anyone to make that space for him. You know, these things, when we let it go, build up, right? So we have to call it out. We have to be the ones actually, you know, giving people that space to have this conversation.
You just defined and you demonstrated what an ally really does, right? And if he had called him out, if the other Black guy had called out the other guy, people might have said, well, of course he's going to call him out. But the fact that you did it is what gives us additional courage. When our allies don't come to our rescue, our allies just call it out.
Right.
You don't always have to be the ones, you know, calling it out. And whatever it is, you know, if it's anti-Semitism, whatever it is, wherever we hear things, we can't just wait on the people we think might be most affected. So allies, again, do the work, and they demonstrate. But we also need the political allies. You know, we can talk about allies in a lot of different categories, but I can tell you that Thurgood Marshall once said there are these unintended consequences of busing, because he didn't vote for busing. That was the congressional solution to separate but equal. But what he thought separate but equal meant was supposed to be equal funding, so that the schools and the communities could remain intact where they were. Just give them the resources, not bust them out of their neighborhoods and send them a different place, and then devalue the schools in their community with less funding and less qualified teachers. So I think we also have to look at what we expect from our political allies in terms of policies and the structures, the governmental structures that we need for programs and support, so it just doesn't come from the people. And hopefully that'll give other folks courage. So we talked a little bit earlier about the Confederate Statue. Well, I remember 2 years ago, Loudoun County Board of Supervisors did not vote to send a letter to Richmond asking for what's called home rule, the self-determination piece. And they said in any other circumstance, they probably would have voted for self-determination because that's what people want. But because it was this particular issue, they didn't trust the people. to do what it was that they wanted to have done. So now you get a new Board of Supervisors, you get a new Virginia House of Delegates in the state Senate, and they believe that people should determine, not government.
Yeah, we're going to get into that because that's a really interesting topic to talk about.
I like political allies when they work. When they don't work, I've got other things to say.
Absolutely, because this is not just someone who can say, oh, racism ends with me and it's just about me. It's a personal thing. You know, there's systematic problems in this country, you know, and it ties back to politics. At the end of the day, that's all that's going to change things. Like when you think about the movements and what things have actually changed, it's because there were political movements that have happened in order to bring that change. So, you know, we need to be allies in that as well, and giving space for those changes to happen. And I'm glad that, you know, although we see the amount of the influence of, you know, the enslavement that has happened, especially in Northern Virginia, where there's so many burial grounds, and, you know, just in the Loudoun Freedom Center, and the work that Pastor Michelle has been doing and bringing all of this into light. I remember, you know, I had posted something about 2 years ago. You were there when we went to a site where there was a burial ground of the enslaved, where they wanted to demolish it. And, you know, we were doing like covert, you know, trespassing in the middle of a snowstorm. But, you know, I thought to myself when I went home, you know, I have never committed a crime before in New York City. I'm doing it now here with a pastor, but that's okay. We didn't get caught. So things like that, in educating myself, because, you know, me thinking, oh, I might know everything. I don't know everything. I don't even know half of it, right? But that's the whole process, right? And that's what we want people to understand, is that they have to look within themselves and change the views that they have and change the mindset that they have, because it's definitely not what they think it is. And we talked about, you know, listening, right? This is another word that has been pushed around so much these days, of allowing the Black community to have a platform where people can listen to them. Now people are listening, and they're getting the information coming in, but like you said, is listening enough? What happens after that? It's the movement, right? So do you think that for people who are really strong-headed and becoming allies, who really want to be that ally, you know, what are the steps that they can take? Are they supposed to take interest in something that they find meaningful in the change of allyship? For instance, you know, getting into a political position on something, helping different organization. What are some options that they might have where they feel that, okay, I have energy, I have time, and I want to give?
Well, again, let me tell you what that doesn't look like, because we saw some of this in the 70s and 80s, where people started wearing dashikis and braiding their hair, and, you know, trying to assume a posture of Blackness when they weren't, and it wasn't theirs, and it wasn't real, and it wasn't sustainable, right? But one of the things that we all can do is continue to celebrate. We can celebrate each other's holidays. We can celebrate each other's faith. I'll talk about Juneteenth another time, but the real date is January 1st, 1863. That's an Independence Day that we really should be celebrating. But let's make sense of the celebrations in each other's communities, and have a chance. So we're not clothed in this appearance of Black Lives Matter as a slogan. Black Lives Matter because we do understand history, because we do understand the pain and the racism and some of the continued oppressions that do exist when it comes to healthcare and academic achievement, you know, and even access to jobs and loans and things. And so it matters when we see people clothing themselves in a I'll call it a higher plane of righteousness, that justice is for all. If justice is for all, and the imperfections in all of our systems are being challenged, so we're not anti-police. We are for proper law enforcement and justice in our society, and the fairness of judges and the fairness of doctors and others to preserve all lives, not just some lives. So it's those kinds of actions that I would promote, because people are in different spaces with different spheres of influence, different levels of education and skills and talents. Use those platforms as learning opportunities. As you said, the Adams Center's doing. Invite people in to speak. Invite people in to share. Make yourself willing to go out and share about opportunities in your space. I've been getting a lot of calls recently, and this is wonderful for the Freedom Center as it relates to grant opportunities and things that we may be in line for to help our mission. That didn't happen as frequently 2 years ago. I thank people for their generosity of information, and we are responding. But those are the kinds of things that allies engage in. It's not just purposeful for their mission, it could be purposeful for ours, so share and partner and help. But there's a lot, obviously, and I talked about the intergenerational piece before because this is generational work. This isn't this year or next year that I have my 18-year-old grandson just graduated from high school, and we've had many conversations about the world as it exists today. And I have 3 sons and a daughter who are also older and, fearful of their children and impact and their messages and where they go and, who they relate to. And they have a more of a, I guess, broader relationship with friends and some elements of disappointment that some of those friends are not allies. And they're fighting with those friends on social media and standing up for Black Lives Matter and now being called somewhat anti-American with someone that they had valued for 3 or 4 years of their high school experience. So they're also learning painful lessons, and it's how to keep them engaged without losing them because of the actions of a few. And that's the other strength of true allyships and partnerships, is that we don't lose generations, we don't go to the extremes of hate and violence, and that we find a middle ground where we can work. And that middle ground is actually where most of us live anyway. We don't live on the fringes. And so it gives us an opportunity to have these helpful conversations like we are today. And I've had probably too many times in my lifetime over the years of this kind of work, but I'm not tired yet.
One thing that I think Rabbi Susan can agree with me is that a lot of the conversation we've been having in the faith circle is people who have been active, from the 60s till now, saying how the demonstrations and the protests have changed in terms of who's actually coming. So back then there weren't that many allies from different backgrounds. Now there are much more, right? Do you think that is something that's part of the positive movement that's happening?
But I think that's reflective of many movements over, the last 30 or 40 years, right? It used to be just the civil rights, but somehow civil rights weren't equal rights for women, yet they were. And so, we've seen the evolution of many movements and organizations that cause us just on a spectrum. And I think I go back and I look at Malcolm X and what he found out when he went to Mecca, was that there was a rainbow coalition of Muslims and not what he thought he was taught. So who represents, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people? We all do, all faith, all religions, all colors. What type of woman doesn't deserve equal rights? Well, every woman on every level. And so we're finding that, culturally, faith-wise, intergenerationally, we all represent all of these things. And so it is now more common to see all of our communities broader represented because we are, and probably always have been.
It's so interesting too to think about and to reflect on how social media has impacted and helped to have a broader spectrum engaged. As we were discussing, and I was sharing earlier before we started, we had in our community, in our town, in Montgomery County, a couple of neighbors who said, you know what, we want to do something. We're not going down to the big rally, the big protest, because they were feeling with, we're still in this age of pandemic and coronavirus, and not wanting to be around crowds, but still also wanting to make sure within our own neighborhood that there was a sense and a recognition that there's a community of support and love and allyship. And so a couple of friends sent an email and actually posted something on Facebook. Would people be, we're planning to do this candlelight vigil. And they gave the route, they told people where to meet, and had no idea if it was just going to be the two families or, and tons of people showed up, and which felt good, recognizing that there were people up and down the street and around the neighborhood who were feeling the same way and felt like we need to see, and we need to be seen, and we want to see our neighbors and show that we care about this issue. And they started a Facebook page, and as I was saying, there are probably just over 300 people on that now. And out of these conversations, there was just a second walk this past weekend. But out of these conversations, people started asking about the street names in the neighborhood. There are several streets named for Confederate generals. And clearly those come from a time when the neighborhood was built in the early 60s, where that was a statement, and that expressed the values that the people establishing the neighborhood or people building the neighborhood, who was in and who was not wanted in the community. And those were values perhaps of a time, but they don't reflect the values of the community. They don't reflect the values of Montgomery County. And so this was raised and brought to the County Council, and we had a couple of council members at our walk this weekend who shared that the County Council, everyone has signed on to do a comprehensive study in Montgomery County, looking at street names, looking at monuments, etc., but to understand and recognize that we stand together. And I think that that's something that a lot of people want to say and are not sure how to say it or who or to whom they should say it. And I think that showing up is such a can mean a lot to those who are, not sure if their neighbors are standing with them. So we might be across the river from each other, but we are side by side, and we stand together. And I think that that's so important, that for those of our listeners who are wondering, do I have to be a politician? What do how can I get involved? Find a walk, there are places to show up where just being able to have that sense of connection to those who care about the face of this country. And Ron, you said it so beautifully. It's, I know, shared in all of our faith traditions, that we're all created, as we say in the book of Genesis, the B'Tselem Elohim, we're all created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God. We might not all look alike, but there is divinity within each one of us, and within each other's faces, we see reflected the face of God. And so it's important for us to show up and to see each other and to make sure that everyone is seen and that everyone is heard. And I know that that's work that you are certainly doing. I know Nessa can speak to that as a faith leader in Loudoun County, how that's being done there.
Right. So I was talking to you guys about the Confederate statue that's in Leesburg, and the Loudoun clergy and religious leadership group that I'm a part of wrote a letter of saying that I was in support of removing the statue. And so it actually got some traction on the news. And I want Ron to actually explain the whole process of what that looked like before and what it looks like now, and hopefully what it will look like to come July 1st.
Let me say, first of all, thank you for a very courageous letter, because not every and all of the comments were pleasant, or people are really appreciating, the intent of understanding that not erasing history, we're involving history. And we did this a couple of years ago as people look at all of these statues and their purpose and their mission when they were created in the early 1900s, probably from 1900 to 1908. They were funded, by Confederate recognition associations, I'll call them, and for the purpose of, really looking at how do you keep the Confederacy alive in the age of Jim Crow was alive and well and growing, and the number of lynchings and things in this country. So these statues and these symbols weren't created to honor war dead, and at that point they were not even considered by the United States veterans of any war, but traitors. And so while there was great division, when these statues were put up, there's still great division now in this country as to the meaning of that history and how it should be celebrated. So when I'm asked in the conversation that I'm having with others, it's about where these symbols should be, if they are to be. But particularly in Loudoun County, it's interesting that it's on the grounds of the courthouse, where justice is supposed to be more of a symbol of what people should expect than a recognition of what happened to protect the Confederacy. And there's even a World War II monument where the white veterans are above the line and the black veterans who died are below the line, very strategically. So we have some corrections to do and where things should be placed, how all of our history should be recognized. And this is the other complete piece. So on Memorial Day, we went to the segregated Mount Zion Community Cemetery, where the only place that blacks in Leesburg could be buried. And we honored the veterans of the Civil War and all other American wars by placing American flags on their graves. At the same time, the Union Cemetery, less than a couple of blocks away, probably had more Confederate flags placed at the sites of Confederate dead than American flags. So we have this stark contrast that we have to address in our society. So it's not just righting the wrongs, it is facing the atmosphere, the culture, the fears, the miseducation, the bad history, and the fact that slavery and the Confederate War was only fought to do one thing, is to keep slaves, and to continue to preserve this racist economic engine that denied people's humanity. And if that's the statue that people really want to have honored, then I want people to come out and defend that history, and rather than just simply say, we're trying to change history. So this is going to provoke a lot of conversation in our community, and it should. It should be people willing on all sides to come and speak freely. We did this a couple of months ago. I think it was last spring with George Mason University Conflict Resolution Center. We were talking about lynchings, and we had a big community meeting about lynchings. And then we celebrated the fact that Leesburg, and I say we celebrated because we didn't memorialize, you don't memorialize lynchings, but you celebrated through recognition that 3 lynchings took place in Leesburg, and we started with 1, working along with the Equal Justice Institute. And the celebration is about how do we help bring awareness and recognition to things that either would be forgotten because of the tragedy or overlooked as they have been. And so we took the time to have this moment of recognition. So I think that's the same. So we have models of how we've done it and how we've had difficult conversations. This is not new work. It may be, again, hard work or difficult work based on people's level of interest and passions, but it's necessary work. Just like changing the names on street signs are, if communities feel that way, then it's absolutely necessary that we look at a common recognition for how we're all celebrated in our community, and then tell the history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. If you want to tell it all. Don't just tell some of it.
Okay, so now go into the statue. Go into the beef, the meaty part.
You know, we have grave sites and memorial parks. It belongs in a mausoleum, not in a courthouse. So the process being that I believe that the Board of Supervisors will engage the community through dialogue and discussion and get some recommendations. They have a Heritage Commission that has given some recognition to what other things might be able to be done previous to the legislation being passed. So my expectation is early fall, this community will have that dialogue and discussion. Again, the final determination will be a Board of Supervisors vote. I hope that the town of Leesburg will send a letter of support of removal. Thus far, some politicians have taken the position, hey, it's not us, it's the Board of Supervisors. Well, it's all of us to have a voice in this. So
And is that because the laws just recently changed where now local municipalities can actually make a decision on what they want to do? And when does that take into effect?
I guess we're waiting for some leadership well, the new law takes effect July 1st. And then it's up to all municipalities to determine what they'd like to do. I know some communities in the Commonwealth have acted sooner out of fear of losing the statues or trying to protect or doing different things with different symbols. But obviously, there's a great many of these types of statues in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
So up until July 1st, what we've seen is where the state was in control of these monuments.
The state was in control, and by state law, you couldn't remove them without state approval.
Okay, and that was something that wasn't going to happen. But now, because things have moved to the local municipalities, things could change depending on the local governing body.
Right, the state legislature passed a law which the governor signed, and the state legislature was unwilling to pass a law previously.
Okay, well, we see changes happening, so hopefully it'll move into the direction that we want it to move to make things better and move things along with allyship. Ron, I want to thank you so much for coming on and giving us your time. I'm going to let you do a closing statement to our viewers, and then I'll have Rabbi Susan do the closing prayer and the call. But thank you so much for coming on, Ron. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Thank you both. I realize I might have jumped around a little bit, and I don't want to devalue, individual efforts to learn, to listen, to work, to share. Again, I'm highly encouraged that many people are stepping out, attending different vigils and meetings and protests, or finding a way within their own communities to have conversation. And I say all of it is valid, whatever role, whatever comfort level, where people choose to begin. And I think this is a different time. This is a tipping point time, I believe, in all of our communities for sustainable, lasting change for what's at stake. And so we've all been brought together by a series of circumstances that are not necessarily pleasant, but it's our responsibility, I think, as a community to address them and do something about them. So anytime anybody wants to reach out, I'm certainly willing and available to have any level of conversation to be as helpful as I can. And my children will tell you I have a lot of opinions.
Well, Ron, thank you so much, not only for being with us, but also because I think in effect, you gave that call. You called all of us and shared with us throughout this conversation, but really just now in reminding us to just, each of us, to start somewhere. If you haven't already started, whether it's, I know there are plenty of resource lists and reading lists that are everywhere. You can pick up the newspaper, you can look at different ways that you can be supportive, whether it is showing up to a local walk, going to Black Lives Matter Plaza, supporting Black businesses. There are all kinds of things you can, it's all over right now, especially with social media, for us to see the different ways that we can stand together. And I think that, of course, is the most important call that we have, is to be there for one another, to stand in not only this moment, but to continue standing together, to continue showing up, and to make sure that we all work to create the society that we know is right there at our fingertips. We just need to work to make sure that is that freedom is there for all, because as Martin Luther King Jr. said, and actually Emma Lazarus wrote, I believe, until we are all free, we are none of us free. And so we all must continue to fight for freedom, to walk for freedom, to speak up for freedom, to show up for freedom, until every person knows, not on June 19th, but on January 1st, that everybody knows, and everybody knows they're free because they experience that freedom. And so we'll keep working together until that freedom is truly experienced by all Americans. And I know that that is for all of us who walk together in faith, who celebrate each other's moments and life cycles and holidays, and celebrate the reality of our lives and what it means to be human beings, sharing our neighborhoods, sharing in each other's cultures, and sharing the connections and the bonds of friendship and humanity. We're all created in God's image, and we need to keep making sure that everyone is seen and heard, and will continue to do that. Ron, we're so grateful for you, for your being here with us today, but also for the work that you do every day. And believe me, we'll be talking to think about ways that we can show up and come to the Freedom Center, and to make sure that that we continue to share and to continue to learn. And as you said, it's just reaching out, and it can be hard to be the one asking the question and to not be sure what the question is, or what the right question is, or what the right words are. But in those hard conversations, it's more important to be in the dialogue, and to know that that we're asking because we care, and that we love our neighbors as ourselves.
Yeah, and we're hoping to bring some people to the Freedom Center and learn and get to know things that people think they know, but they really don't know. There's so much hidden just within our area, like it's right in our backyard. Right, Ron?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot to learn. Again, thank you so much for coming. Rabbi Susan, thank you for coming on as well, my wonderful co-host. Prayers to your families and to everyone, and we'll talk to you soon. Hopefully have you back on when things get moving along. Thank you for the great work that you're doing in Leesburg, and keep the tractor moving, moving along. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.